Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Wall of Power TV. I'm your host, Paul Metsa. I couldn't be more delighted to have as my guest University of Minnesota law professor Richard Painter, who is running to become the next senator on the DFL ticket from the great state of Minnesota. From February 2005 to July 2007, he was associate counsel to President George W. Bush in the White House counsel's office, serving as the chief ethics lawyer. He is a board member and vice chair of Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, as well as a founding board member of Take Back Our Republic, a campaign finance reform organization. Without any further ado, a man that might be the next senator from the great state of Minnesota, Professor Richard Painter. Richard, thanks for being here today.
Thank you very much, Paul.
I can't turn on the TV and not see you on MSNBC or CNN or the variety of other nationally syndicated television shows you've been on. So I want to thank you for being here on Wall of Power TV, broadcasting on Studio 6, MCN 6, right out of Northeast Minneapolis.
Thank you for having me.
We're honored to have you. I've been following you now for, a year and a half, a couple of years. Your message resonates with so much of my core beliefs. As you know, politicians are known for speaking out of both sides of their mouth. You don't do that. We're going to talk about several of the issues today, but I want to ask you, because you keep your eye on the pulse. So May 10th, we had the 3 hostages come back from North Korea, and it was the last time we saw Melania Trump. You don't think there's any truth to the rumor that she was exchanged for those hostages, do you?
No, I don't think so. I'd actually rather keep Melania and exchange Donald Trump for the hostages.
Of course, I'm being a bit facetious, but that's the latest thing I read when I get up this morning.
I'd throw Mike Pence into the deal, too.
Well, it's interesting, because we'll talk about that. Pence has really been standing in the shadows, and but I think with your belief, he's as complicit with all of what you consider, and many of us consider to be basically running this country unconstitutionally. And you're a constitutional scholar. Tell us a little bit about the young Richard, how you got interested in politics and law.
Well, I grew up in central Illinois, Champaign County, Illinois, and most people down there were Republicans when I was growing up because they detested the Chicago machine run by Mayor Daley, which was racist. Mayor Daley refused to include African Americans in Chicago Democratic politics in those days, and of course corrupt.
Right.
And that's how I got involved in the Republican Party, because I went back to teach at the University of Illinois in the 1990s, hooked up with a lot of people who I had known growing up as a kid, and I joined the Republican Party. But the Republican Party had already started to move dramatically to the right of where I am on a whole range of issues. I'd hoped to pull it back to the center, but it hasn't worked out that way. And I also learned in Illinois that both parties are equally corrupt. We had a Republican governor go to jail, Governor Ryan, and then right after him, Governor Blagojevich, a Democrat, went to jail. Indeed, we had them both serving their terms concurrently in the federal penitentiary. That's a real embarrassment, I've got to say. So I became very interested in ethics, government ethics, as well as corporate ethics. I spent a lot of time writing and giving speeches about what's going on Wall Street back in the 1990s, early 2000s. And that's how I got into the Bush White House as the ethics lawyer. My job was trying to keep Mel out of jail. I did all right on that when they'd bother to listen to me. It was not a partisan political job. Nobody sought my input on policy matters. I certainly have different views than a lot of people in the Bush administration had, but I tried to clean them out of their financial conflicts of interest and tell them not to do things like lie to a grand jury. We had no problem with that with the Vice President's Chief of Staff, Scooter Libby, who recently got a full pardon from President Trump. sending the message it's absolutely okay to lie to a grand jury in the view of President Trump.
Telegraphing.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's crazy what's going on. So I've had my issues with the Republican Party over the years, but then along comes Donald Trump. And this is very, very different than what we've seen before. Donald Trump is committed to an authoritarian mode of governing. He has no respect for the Constitution of the United States, whether it's the First Amendment right to freedom of the press, or the right to free exercise of religion, whether it's the independent judiciary. We've had him attack a judge simply for being a Mexican American and saying that makes the judge biased. We've had him call for a travel ban, which is really a Muslim ban. We've had him take specific steps to interfere with freedom of the press. He has no respect for our Constitution, and unfortunately the Republican Party is falling in behind Donald Trump and refusing to support anyone for elected office at the federal level who will not be loyal to Donald Trump. That is not the way political parties function in a democracy. So I've said goodbye to the Republican Party, and I have entered the Democratic Farmer Labor Party primary for the United States Senate.
Richard, what attracted you to the Republican Party in the first place?
Well, as I said, when I was young in Central Illinois, people were Republican just because they saw that the Republican Party is useful for pushing back against the daily machine that controlled Chicago. So you had liberal Republicans, people like myself, very concerned about what's going on Wall Street and the rest of it. And you had some very conservative Republicans. And then up in the Chicago machine, you had quite a few racists, including Mayor Daley himself. And then you had some very liberal and progressive people in the Democratic Party as well. But the two parties, when I was growing up, reflected a broad range of political philosophies. What has happened steadily over the past several decades, particularly since 1980, is that the Republican Party has moved to the right, and increasingly so as the years go by. They brought in the religious right, people who were not really welcome in the Republican Party before 1980. They were brought in to try to win elections on the abortion issue and homophobia and the rest of it. Well, those people, by the end of the 1990s, had taken over, and certainly by the 2000s. And then we see President Trump with his so-called evangelical council that's willing to pardon everything he does simply for the sake of trying to overturn Roe versus Wade. We've had people with extremely hawkish views about the Middle East coming into the Republican Party, people eager to start more wars. That's a very dangerous trend. It's very unfortunate what's happened to the Republicans over the years. But I believed it was salvageable until Donald Trump came along, because what we're introducing now, as I say, is authoritarianism, disrespect for the Constitution, people who do not want to live in a democracy. And there's no reasoning with such people. Unfortunately, I think the Republican Party is a lost cause, certainly under Donald Trump, and I don't see a future after Donald Trump unless there's a complete reversal of the attitude of the party leaders.
Well, one thing I've always thought was hypocritical about the Republicans is they call for getting government off your backs, for smaller government, yet they're the first party that wants to get into your bloodstream and your bedroom.
Yes, and that's a trend that started in 1980. Before 1980, Republicans were, if anything, more adamant than Democrats about separation of church and state, and you didn't have the religious right running the party. A lot of mainline Protestants and others who did not want government funding religious organizations, who did not want government interfering with people's personal decisions. Even Barry Goldwater supported reproductive choice for women. Planned Parenthood was supported by George H.W. Bush, so much so that his nickname apparently was Rubbers. He quickly put that to rest when he ran on the vice presidential ticket with Ronald Reagan.
That's something you're only going to hear on Wall of Power TV.
Absolutely, but it was true.
Well, what I've always loved, I was born, I'm a few years older than you. I was born in 1955. But I really came of age, you really became aware on the Iron Range of John F. Kennedy, of course, and then the tragic assassination. and then the rise of LBJ, of course, after that. But Barry Goldwater in 1964, of course, ran for president, so we were very aware of him. But over the years, I think as he got older, he was really, to me, seemed a little bit more of a libertarian than a Republican. But he had a great line that I'd like to remind my friends that don't think gays should serve in the military, because Barry had a grandson who was gay. And he said something that I thought was pretty to the point, so to speak. He said, to be in the Army, he goes, you don't have to be straight, you just have to shoot straight.
Absolutely right. Barry Goldwater was wrong on a lot of things. He was so much in favor of states' rights that he missed the boat on the Civil Rights Act, and I certainly blame him for that. I think he's one of many Americans who way overreacted to what the Russians were doing, to the point of perhaps wanting to risk a nuclear war in confronting Russia. Now, of course, we're way underreacting to what Russia is doing and ignoring it. So I think Barry Goldwater had his shortcomings, but Barry Goldwater was never someone who embraced the religious right. He warned that the religious right were a bunch of nutcakes, and he had Jewish heritage as well as Protestant heritage. He understood the threat that the so-called evangelical right, which is really not evangelical at all, it's just an ideology of hatred that uses Christianity to win elections. He understood how dangerous those people are, and he spoke out against them very, very forcefully. He spoke out against campaign finance, money coming in from corporations and labor unions into political campaigns. So he was right on that. So Barry Goldwater was right on a number of things, even though, as I say, I think he was tragically wrong on the Civil Rights Act, as well as what the appropriate response was to communist aggression at the time.
You came on board with George Bush. What year was that?
I went in as the White House ethics lawyer in 2005, served until 2007. In the White House, I was responsible for financial conflicts of interest and compliance with the ethics rules. It's not a policy job. I didn't get to decide who the nominees ought to be as a matter of political ideology or philosophy. I was there when they appointed two people to the United States Supreme Court, Justice Alito and Chief Justice Roberts. I had no input into who they should appoint with respect to judicial philosophy. What I did do was sit down with the candidates for those jobs and go through their financial situation, financial conflicts of interest, whether they had previously decided cases in which they might have a financial conflict of interest. So whoever was chosen to be the nominee could go in front of the United States Senate without a serious ethics problem. That was my job. Ethics, those don't party. As my successor in the Obama administration, Norman Eisen, has said repeatedly, ethics should not be a political enterprise. And that's why I believe I did as good a job as I could in the Bush administration when people would listen to me. I didn't need to be a conservative Republican in order to do that. As I say, they had no interest in my views on issues. But when I said there was a conflict of interest or something was illegal, when they bothered to ask me, I'd tell them, and I'd make doggone sure that they were listening to me.
And you work with Norm Eisen, right, in a group?
Yes, Norman Eisen was in the White House, of course, after I was, because he was with President Obama, and then he went to become the ambassador to the Czech Republic. When he came home, he worked with Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington in a volunteer capacity. He was over at the Brookings Institution. He asked me to come aboard at Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington, CREW is our name, as the vice chair. And so we at CREW have vigorously pursued corruption in both political parties. We're a bipartisan group, but President Donald Trump has given us a lot of extra work to do, including bringing a lawsuit against him for his violation of the United States Constitution by receiving payments, profits and benefits from foreign governments. So I worked with Norman Eisen on that and a number of other things. And yes, with Trump in office, CREW has had to work overtime.
More with our guest Richard Painter after these messages. Welcome back to Wall of Power TV. I'm delighted to have in the studio for the whole show tonight Professor Richard Painter, who's running to be the next senator of Minnesota. Richard, when did you end up back in Minnesota? I know you were a professor at the University of Minnesota. When did you find your way back to the Twin Cities?
Well, I came here in 2007 after serving in the Bush White House as the chief ethics lawyer. I had previously been at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which is the town I'd grown up in, and I'd gone back to teach law. But I decided to come here. My wife got a job teaching music history. She's a tenured professor at the University of Minnesota in the music department. We love the Twin Cities. We love Minnesota. It's a wonderful place to live. And I have to say the politics here is a lot cleaner than in Illinois. We've got our problems, happy to talk about them, but it's much better than what goes on down there.
Well, and you look at the storied history of Minnesota politicians and Supreme Court justices, you know, Hugo Blackmun, Earl Warren, Hubert Humphrey, of course, Paul Wellstone. Did you ever get a chance to meet Wellstone over the years? You're both professors running for Senate.
Unfortunately, I never did. He was killed shortly after I'd arrived, and I was not involved in politics very much when I was getting involved in teaching, getting back into teaching at the University of Minnesota. And Paul Wellstone is a great loss to the state of Minnesota.
I was recently in Memphis with two good friends of mine staying for the weekend, and I have other friends around the country that are very politically inclined like myself. And your national profile and the support you have nationally, at least in my circle of friends, is very powerful. And I hope this translates to the land of 10,000 lakes. How do you feel it's going in Minnesota for the Senate race right now?
So far, so good. I want to talk to people about issues. And there are going to be a lot of issues I agree with Senator Smith on. There are going to be some we disagree. We're also going to have somewhat different priorities. I, for example, want to make sure that we get Trump and Pence out of there as soon as possible. I think they're a threat to our democracy. And so I think the Senate needs to prioritize an investigation along the lines of what was done with Watergate back when I was a child, and I still remember watching those hearings when I was growing up in Central Illinois. We're well past the point with both Trump and Pence where there ought to be an investigation by the House and Senate, but they're not doing diddly squat right now other than making up spy stories from the time during the Obama administration or going through Hillary's email. So that's a top priority for me. We need to have a debate. I would like to have a debate with Senator Smith, and I believe I'll prevail, and if I do prevail in the election, a debate with Karin Housley, who will be the Republican nominee. What are our priorities in the United States Senate? What is our attitude toward copper and nickel mining in northern Minnesota, which is going to pollute our boundary waters and the Duluth watershed?
Can we talk a little bit about that? Because, of course, that's where I'm from. I'm a double Scorpio water sign. I don't mean to get too cosmic here on you, but I grew up on Lake Vermilion, considered one of the finest freshwater lakes, not only in Minnesota, but the world. And, of course, spent a lot of time in Duluth and Superior around Lake Superior. Tell us a little bit about what you know. I'm very familiar with polymet that they want to put by the Laurentian Divide and twin metals that they want to put by the boundary waters. But let's talk about who owns these mines.
Yes, these are copper-nickel mines. We have not tried copper-nickel mining in Minnesota, and it is very dangerous near waterways because copper-nickel mining involves digging up an enormous amount of material, taking only 1% out and leaving the rest, and it's all going to get into the water. It is very, very dangerous. It has generally been done around the world in drier places where you don't have to worry about polluting the waterways. So that's the problem. Environmentalists have made it very, very clear that this is an enormous threat. These mines are not owned by Minnesotans. They're owned by billionaires who are not Americans. One of the mines, the Twin Metals mine, which will be up near Ely, that will pollute the boundary waters, is owned by a billionaire from Chile. And he also owns the Banco de Chile that a number of years ago made some election year loans to the president of Chile. He is now running around Washington, D.C., giving money to various think tanks. I ran into him at a speech I gave at the Brookings Institution, and he'd given them a lot of money. He's one of the big donors, and he's very interested in talking to me because I'm from Minnesota. He wants to open up the copper and nickel mine. He is also the landlord for Jared and Ivanka Trump. He heard they wanted a house in Colorado.
Can't make this stuff up.
Absolutely. He'd heard they wanted a house in Colorado, which is the fancy pants section of Washington, D.C. Yeah, the house is about a $12 million house or whatever. So he just bought it and he leases it to him. Well, so that's one guy.
He bought it primarily just to rent it to.
He bought it, I believe, right there after the election.
Wow.
Yeah, he's not in the real estate business. He's in the schmoozing politicians business.
Right.
Where he wants to make money is opening the mine right near the boundary waters and take what he can out of it and then leave the rest for us to clean up. And that's
Because his company, there's a long name, I believe it starts with an A, has a terrible environmental record as well.
Oh yeah, they've been making a mess, everywhere where they go, and they don't care because if they bribe the local politicians or whatever they do to get what they want, of course you can't call it bribery unless someone actually gets caught with a quid pro quo. We know what goes on in politics, but bottom line is they have a terrible environmental record. But the politicians are in their back pocket; they can do whatever they want. Well, I say no in Minnesota. That's not happening here. The second mine, the Paul Metsa mine, is controlled by a company called Glencore. Glencore is a Swiss company with a lot of British investors. Nathaniel Rothschild, who has mines all over the world with a terrible environmental record. His friend Oleg Deripaska, who is a Russian oligarch, who is a client of Paul Manafort, currently under sanctions. He's involved with Glencore. And then they hired Tony Hayward to be the chairman of Glencore.
From BP.
Yeah, Tony Hayward is a guy at British Petroleum who was in charge when the Deepwater Horizon disaster occurred. And Tony Hayward said that was just going to be a very minor incident with minimal environmental impact. Well, when he got the boot from British Petroleum after that whole thing blew up, Nat Rothschild went into business with him doing Iraqi oil deals. And then brought him into Glencore, is he put this cast of characters together, throwing a handful of Russian oligarchs, and said, are these the people we want controlling a mine in Minnesota to extract copper and nickel? Once again, that's only 1% of what comes out of the ground is going to be the copper and nickel. And who's going to end up getting the copper and nickel? Probably the Russians, and they deal with the Iranians as well. That's not the way to grow the economy in Minnesota. That's not the way to create jobs. It's very, very short-sighted. Where they want to mine the copper and nickels on federal land. So they come up with a land swap proposal where Polymat, which is this Glencore outfit, will take some of its own land and swap it with the federal government for federal land. And then once they get control of the federal land, which is no longer federal land, if we do the land swap, they don't have to obey the environmental regulations that apply to federal land. And then they can make a big mess. It's a terrible idea, yet it's tragic that the Republican Party establishment supports it and also the Democratic Farmer Labor Party establishment. We have both of our senators supporting this atrocious land swap, I don't know what Governor Dayton thinks. I hope he would oppose it going out. He's a strong environmentalist, and he ought to do the right thing.
His family has a cabin on Lake Vermilion about 3 miles from ours.
Yeah, they're good people.
Yep.
He ought to say no, just no. It's wrong. And, we don't have to cater to the mining industry, particularly the most corrupt part of the mining industry, in order to build the economy in the 8th Congressional District and elsewhere in Minnesota. It makes absolutely no sense. It's going to destroy our economy in the long run because we'll destroy tourism. The boundary waters and the Duluth watershed are places where people aren't going to want to live. And once again, these mine owners are foreign billionaires with a terrible environmental record, with a very extensive record of throwing their influence around with politicians to get what they want, and zero interest in Minnesota.
And the other thing is, between Lake Superior and northeastern Minnesota, and the rest of Minnesota, the freshwater lakes, we're sitting on 20% of the fresh water in the world. And I've always said water is going to be the next oil. I mean, you can see it right now with the water shortages all over the world, which I think behooves us to protect 1/5 of this God-given natural resource.
Absolutely. Because of climate change, we are in a very serious situation with respect to water around the world. And we have water resources here. We need to protect them. We obviously need to do something about climate change as well. But once again, we got the same problem there. It's the fossil fuel industry that has Congress bought and has extensive influence in both political parties. If we don't address our environmental concerns, we're going to have a planet that is uninhabitable by humans. If we lose our water, that's going to be the beginning of the end. We need to protect our waterways, and Minnesota is ground zero for the fight for clean water.
More with Richard Painter on the Wall of Power TV after these messages.